right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Angela Pearson. I'm an associate professor of architecture at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm also co-curator of the Outré West exhibition with a team of folks who you'll get to meet in just a little bit. I want to extend our gratitude to our many partners and supporters. The Oklahoma Contemporary staff, past and present, has been a joy to work with. We're so grateful for their partnership and openness to allowing us to pursue this wild project. We're so grateful to our incredible students, colleagues, and staff at the University of Oklahoma, many of whom built the full-scale reconstructions and models in the gallery. If you are a part of that team, can you wave your hand? I know we have a couple, I see Joey there and a few others. Thank you so much. This would not have been possible without the support of OU's Vice President for Research and Partnerships, whose Humanities and Arts and Society Seed Grant program provided foundational support for the exhibition. We're also grateful for the support of the Division of Architecture Professional Advisory Board, as well as the Bruce Goff Chair of Creative Architecture. To the OU Libraries team, who meticulously loaned and digitized more than 100 precious objects from their special collections, we offer our deepest gratitude. We are also indebted to the many Oklahoma City-based vendors who helped us bring this dream of an exhibition to life. We would also like to recognize our college's dean, Hans Butzer, as well as the director of the Division of Architecture, Daniel Butko, and many other colleagues, staff, and students who've supported the American School project with sincere enthusiasm over the years. Finally, we must recognize the architects of the American School for their marvelous work, as well as their friends and family members who have helped us preserve their legacies, including the Friends of Kebiar, and a former leader of the Friends of Kebiar is with us in the audience this evening, Nelson. All right. So in particular, we'd also like to thank Sherry Faust, whose planned gift will ensure that we can continue uncovering new layers of the American School story for years to come. Sherry's just announced a matching gift fund. She's committed to making a gift of up to $100,000 to support the ongoing work of the American School project. Your gift of $1,000 or more will be doubled thanks to Sherry's generous support. All right, and on now to the main event. And yes, thanks. And it's now my pleasure to introduce 2024 Bruce Goff Chair of Creative Architecture, architect and historian Alan Hess. Alan is the author of more than 20 books on modern and organic American architecture, including the work of John Lautner, Frank Lloyd Wright, and on the modern architecture of cities and regions, including Palm Springs, Las Vegas, and more. He's been a fierce advocate for preserving and celebrating the incredible history of American modernism. Please join me in welcoming Alan Hess.
Good afternoon. It is great to be here, and I must say, great honor. Many years ago, I was the student host for Bruce Goff when he came to my architecture school, UCLA. And I had known of him. I fortunately had a teacher who was born here in Oklahoma who knew him and had introduced us to his work long ago. So the American School, Goff, organic architecture has been on my mind for a long time. What I hope to do this afternoon, having seen the great exhibit, extraordinary, great to see all of that work together. But what I hope to do in the next few minutes is show how this architecture, these architects, these ideas fit into the larger story of modern architecture. It's a story that has not often been told, but it is an extremely important story. And it is a story that you here at OU in Oklahoma have, and it is your duty, I believe, to help spread that, to let the world, the nation of the world, know what was here and explain it to the rest of the world. So, my first slide has absolutely nothing to do with my talk. but it sets the stage at least for the wide expanse of American design all through its history. Automotive history is part of that. And I just love this slide, which is why I have it here. But my talk goes on to talk about architecture. I was taught certain things in architecture school, fortunately including Goff, but otherwise it was pretty mainstream. And the whole story that was told was that modern architecture started in Europe and then was imported into the United States and produced some excellent architecture through the years. But in the years after I was in architecture school, as I explored the country a little bit more, explored history a little bit more, that story did not quite fit with what I was seeing. And so I had to figure things out. For example, we have, of course, the Bauhaus, founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius, is one of the key architectural landmarks of this history of modern architecture. Here is the Director's House in Dessau by Walter Gropius from 1925. The year before, the Oasis Hotel was built in Palm Springs, California by Lloyd Wright. Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. It is an extraordinary, I consider this, since I've kind of discovered it and researched it, this is one of the most important buildings of the early modern era, first half of the 20th century. But it's virtually forgotten, virtually unknown. It's not in any of the textbooks. Half of it is still standing in downtown Palm Springs. Go there the next time you're there. But this was kind of disturbing. Well, how does this fit in? It's a great piece of architecture dealing with new technology, new materials, new ideas. Why wasn't it being talked about? Or, again, in the textbooks, I would more often see interiors like the one on the right. This is Case Study House number 21 by Pierre Koenig in Los Angeles. The epitome of what I was taught was modern architecture. Abstract, black and white, with a few splashes of color from throw pillows, but definitely minimalist. Take away, do less. But then also, my first book was on Googie architecture, like this coffee shop, Norm's Coffee Shop in Los Angeles on the left. What is it about? It's not about right angles, it's about curves, it's about colors, it's about textures. How do these all fit together into the mainstream story of modern architecture? So, we have, of course, these great innovators of modern architecture, people like Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and Frank Lloyd Wright. He's always mentioned. But it's important to realize, Wright, of course, was a generation older. And where did, especially Gropius and Mies, where did they get many of their ideas from? The Vosmuth portfolio of Frank Lloyd Wright from the early 1910s, which first introduced what Wright was already doing in Chicago to Europe and inspired them in extraordinary ways. And they both have written and spoke about that influence. From where? From America, from Frank Lloyd Wright. So, again, another kind of piece of the puzzle. Why isn't that ever kind of put into the story? Well, instead of those architects, I'd like to go back a little bit further. Conceptually, where did modernism start in America? What were the ideas which developed, were part of the atmosphere, part of the culture of America from at least the early 19th century that led to this discovery, exploration, efflorescence of architecture later on in the 20th century. And I put these two men as two of the founders of modern architecture, modern ideas. First of all, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great philosopher, writer, thinker from early 19th century America. And he talked, among many things, but he talked about nature, the character of nature in the New World, in this continent, and what that meant. And it becomes very profound about it. It has a spiritual quality, but it also has a very practical quality as well. On the other side of this mix, we have Henry Ford, the icon of modern technology, figuring out how to use industry in new ways, inventive ways, and how to spread it democratically throughout the population as well. Now, these two things, nature and technology, usually they're like on opposite poles. They don't go together, or they're in conflict, or they're set side by side, but in contrast. Was there a way to combine those? That was the interesting challenge, which I think modern architecture in America, starting in the late 19th century, really grappled with. Why? Because nature was something they could not ignore. It was out there. They lived amongst it. They also could not ignore technology, industrialization, the spread of the railroad trains across America, changing the way people lived. So how do you bring those two ideas together? Well, in my understanding of modern architecture, it really basically starts with Frank Furness in Philadelphia after the Civil War. Now, Philadelphia was the Silicon Valley of its day. Extraordinary technological innovations, many having to do with the railroads, a mode of communication to link together this huge continent. He was one of the architects for the Pennsylvania Railroad in particular. And so here in Philadelphia, and again, this is Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia, inventive, try new things. You may be a poor boy, but if you have ideas, you can go as far as you want and change the world. So, just one example, the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia. The facade, at first glance, looks very much like a Victorian building of its age. In fact, no, Furness was not really, in that sense, a Victorian architect. The side view of that Academy of Arts, for example, shows a steel truss, and it shows glass skylights, which would illuminate the students' rooms and the galleries inside. Using these modern technological elements, steel, glass, etc., which were being used in the factories of Philadelphia at that time, and using them as architecture. Furness is an important figure, extremely important figure. One day, so important in fact, that one day a young architecture student was wandering the streets of Philadelphia, and he wanted a job. He was looking around, looking at what buildings were appealed to him. He found several. He asked who the architect was. They were all by Frank Furness. So he went to ask Frank Furness if he could have a job. Furness said yes. That young man was Louis Sullivan. And of course, Sullivan is part of the story of modern architecture. The skyscraper built on the steel frame as well, like the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, New York. Or, of course, the jewel box banks throughout the Midwest as well. Extraordinary. The range of Sullivan's understanding, not only of new technology, new construction, new purposes, new programs, skyscrapers, office buildings downtown, but also combining it with his understanding and the beauty, of course, of nature as well in these banks. So here we see how the American school, not called that, of course, at that time, but the American school was combining technology and nature. So, another story about two young architects. That is the Guarantee Building from 1896 in Buffalo. You see it in contrast to the Gothic church, the Romanesque office building, and there's a kind of a Beaux-Arts office building behind there. Look how startlingly new and different for the industrial city of Buffalo this was. Working in Sullivan's office in Chicago in the early 1890s were two young men, Frank Lloyd Wright and Irving J. Gill as well. And they started this dissemination, this diaspora of these ideas rooted in Furness, Sullivan, technology, nature, etc. And in my sense of things, really kind of laid the foundation, because this story that this exhibit downstairs tells us now. Both of these men, along with Bruce Goff, who I'll get to in just a moment, were teachers. And they were taking these ideas, again, based upon Sullivan, and teaching them. And then their students were going out across the nation, designing all manner of different types of buildings. An extraordinary thing to create the America of the 20th century. So, to begin with, Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, that story is fairly well told. The prairie houses like the Hertley House in Oak Park as well, based upon Sullivan's ideas, but taking it in a new direction, taking it a little bit further. Gill also moved to San Diego in 1893, and over the years develops an extraordinary way to express these buildings and these technologies. And his direction, very different than Wright's visually, but still extremely rich and based upon these basic ideas, are seen in, for example, the Allen House of 1907. Stripped down, clean of ornament, flat roof, modern construction, for the most part concrete that he used, but also dealing with the culture of San Diego, the lifestyle, the climate, indoor-outdoor living, architecture which responded to the place, the nature of the place. Now, nature, of course, in America has a number of different characteristics. When Ralph Waldo Emerson was writing in Massachusetts in the early 19th century, he was amidst the forests of New England as well. Beautiful seasonal changes to these buildings, thick forest, etc. That was nature, and it inspired him. But then, as America grew out to the prairie, out to Chicago and Frank Lloyd Wright and the prairie style and so forth, you have an entirely different type of nature. So the sense of nature keeps expanding and keeps inspiring these architects in new ways and doing new types of architecture. Go a little bit further west, as America moves west, you have the deserts. What do those do also? Very different visually, materials, climatologically certainly, but also architects were inspired by that. And finally you get out to the Pacific coast as well, where Mickey Muennig, Big Sur in particular in this image, lived, and we can see downstairs as well exactly how he worked only in Big Sur, primarily throughout his life, but that place inspired him. He drew so much from it. And so for each of these four different types of American nature, we have Alden Dow, who was an apprentice with Frank Lloyd Wright. In Oklahoma, we have Herb Green, who studied with Bruce Goff. Paulo Soleri, out in the deserts of Arizona, who was an apprentice for Frank Lloyd Wright. And of course, Mickey Muennig. Now look at these four different buildings, just as an example. There's so much more that, of course, I can't get into. And it's very frustrating not to be able to give you my full talk, which would be a couple of hours, but you're spared that. But look how different the forms are. Different forms, different materials, etc. But they're growing from those ideas, respect for the place, respect for nature, and an interest in new technology, engineering, etc., to create new forms from creativity. This is the story of how the American school spread and how it influenced modern architecture. For example, Irving Gill, in the beautiful climate of San Diego, it's the best climate certainly in California, and he would integrate his houses indoors and outdoors. Now, at the time, he used wood sliding doors to connect the dining room to the outdoor patio. So the outdoors became a room, a livable room. That was the technology of the time. We later invented aluminum sliding glass doors, but the idea continued as technology advanced. Now, another interesting thread in this is the architect Will Price, who worked with Frank Furness in Philadelphia. He went on to establish also a whole thread of modern buildings in the early 20th century. For example, again, for the Pennsylvania Railroad, kind of the Apple of the day, this freight warehouse in Chicago from 1915. Its strong tower, its original ornament, extremely modern, new for the time, innovative for the time. Or for the modern recreational industry, which was growing as America became more prosperous in the early 20th century, the Traymore Hotel in Atlantic City, a reinforced concrete building with an entirely original ornamental scheme to it as well, again, coming out of Furness's ideas. The fragment here is from the warehouse building. It looks, perhaps to most of us, vaguely Art Deco. But this was 10 years before the Paris Exposition, which gave its name to the Art Deco movement. Things were going on, coming out of this American school of architecture, inventing new forms, new types of buildings, new types of ornament as well. This is a story, again, which I commend OU and the architecture school here for getting into this. This is a rich area that has so much more for us to learn from. Getting back to the Oasis Hotel, for example, by Lloyd Wright from 1924 in Palm Springs. This was a slip-form concrete construction. Concrete at this time was a fairly new technology. The material was ancient, but how to use it scientifically was taken up by many architects and engineers. So this was a slip-form concrete building. You can see the horizontal lines in the building on the far left there, which showed how the building was made and used the construction method for the building as part of the ornamental and formal character of the building, mating technology with natural expression as well. There's also ornamental elements up on the top of the tower and so forth. Just an extraordinary building, which is now empty. It's in the center of downtown Palm Springs. I'm hoping, with all the interest in modern architecture in Palm Springs, that this will get more attention. Of course, Bruce Goff as well. We all know his work, so I'm just representing it here by the Boston Avenue Church. Again, early on. He wasn't trained in conventional architecture schools. He came up with these ideas. From where? From his life here in the Midwest, Oklahoma, and in Chicago later as well. There are roots, there is inspiration, there are new ideas, there's the support for new ideas even in this period, in this area, and he took advantage of it. And of course, he went on to be one of the great educators in the American school. Now, the center of gravity shifts west. In the mid to late 1920s, Frank Lloyd Wright comes out to Arizona. There he is in front of the Ocotillo camp. He lived in Wisconsin, and he would travel to Scottsdale, or Arizona at that time, in the winter months as well. There he is, Olga Vanna at his side, two of their children in the back seat. And this was just the beginning of the discovery of the West. Now, in 1936, of course, Wright, who was at that time forgotten, he was an old man. He was of the 19th century. He wasn't at the avant-garde as far as the architecture profession considered. But around 1936, he designs and builds two things, Falling Water and Johnson Wax. This suddenly puts him back at the very top of the architecture world. And what is fascinating is, what does he do with that fame? Finally, people are coming to him wanting him to design buildings for them. He could have gone to New York, center of the media world, been published a lot. He could have gone back to Chicago as well, still a vital architectural area. But no, he moves out west to Scottsdale. Scottsdale was nothing in the 1930s, just a little dusty Arizona town. But what was it that impelled him to move out west to a place like Scottsdale? Well, as it turned out, he was prescient, because the center of gravity of the nation, not only of the population, but of its industries, its ideas, aerospace, oil, tourism, media, Hollywood, etc., was all moving west. And the population was moving that way as well. So even though it wasn't widely known in the 1930s, it was there, it was growing. I'm going to give Frank Lloyd Wright the benefit of the doubt that he had some inkling that this was the place to be. And you can see how from the prairie style, the Roby House up there, to the Los Angeles block houses like the Millard House, he's working with a new palette of materials and forms and purposes as well that he does derive from this new area, the West, in particular, the Arizona desert. Well, a third generation now comes from Wright and Goff and others, and not necessarily students, but people influenced by the ideas of Wright and Goff. It spreads all across the country. Herb Green, of course, was a student of Goff. Alfred Browning Parker did not work with Frank Lloyd Wright, but he imbibed the ideas. Alden Dow in Michigan as well was an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright. So we see these ideas dispersing around the country. What I like to do right now is to go over a couple of the other Western architects that are not included in the exhibit, but which I hope will become a focus for future study, books, exhibits, films, whatever. And just give you an idea of how these ideas spread and with what great creativity. Fred and Lois Langhorst. Now, interesting couple. Fred Langhorst was an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright's. Lois Wilson Langhorst studied here at OU. And they married, and after World War II, they moved to San Francisco, and they deserve a whole book themselves. This is just one of their houses as well, which shows you exactly how they were working with these new ideas. Daniel Lieberman, also in the San Francisco Bay Area. Jack Hilmer, never studied with Wright, but he knew Wright. He was a friend of Wright. Whenever Wright would come out to California to build the Marin County Civic Center, for example, they would dine together with the Pawson sisters, Rose Pawson, who had Wright design that beautiful house that burned in Scottsdale. Anyway, Jack Hilmer was very much enamored of Wright's ideas. Also in San Francisco, Charles Warren Callister. This is a Christian Science church in Belvedere, California as well. Just remarkable. I had the honor of working for Warren Callister early on in my career. Or John Marsh Davis, also in Marin County, that Hans is going to talk about a little bit more. But there were larger architects as well. Anshin and Allen. Robert Anshin and Steve Allen did not study. They actually went to the University of Pennsylvania. But they moved to San Francisco, established a firm which became a major firm in the San Francisco area. Also, Edward Durrell Stone was a great friend of Frank Lloyd Wright's. This is the Stanford Hospital in Palo Alto. Of course, in Big Sur, an artist colony, a great deal of very interesting architects attracted there. Mickey Muennig, of course, worked with Goff. Rowan Maiden and Mark Mills were both apprentices of Frank Lloyd Wright at different times. Down to San Diego. Extraordinary things. So San Diego is kind of forgotten in the shadow, I'm sorry to say, of San Francisco and Los Angeles. But in the 19 teens, Irving Gill, again, was working there. And working with him was Lloyd Wright, who you see in the far right, upper right-hand corner. But also working there in San Diego were Barry Byrne, who had been an employee of Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago during the Prairie period, and the sculptor Alfonso Iannelli, who, of course, designed those very famous sprites for the Midway Gardens, which are associated with Frank Lloyd Wright now. John Lloyd Wright, another son of Frank Lloyd Wright, also was in San Diego. So San Diego was in one of these hotbeds of interest in the American school. It went on through the rest of the century as well, with Fred Liebhardt, who was, and Sim Bruce Richards, both of whom were apprentices with Frank Lloyd Wright. And then more recently as well, Kendrick Bangs Kellogg, who just died earlier this year. Extraordinary man. Again, he was not an apprentice of Wright, but he was greatly influenced and inspired since the 1950s with Wright. This is just a sample of the creativity and the diversity of his forms. And I would like to throw this in as well. I mean, today, the past couple of decades, Rem Koolhaas, Zaha Hadid, and others with parametric architecture have been introduced to these, these unusual forms, geometries, et cetera. Well, Ken Kellogg was doing this decades ago, as well as other architects of this, of the American school. Lloyd Wright had a great career in Los Angeles, so again, in the shadow of his father, unfortunately. But the Wayfarers Chapel, one of his great landmarks as well, which you may have heard, it was being torn apart by a landslide. And it has now been completely deconstructed and saved, and they are looking for another site to reconstruct it. So keep your fingers crossed on that one. An extraordinarily popular building as well. Everyone from Ray Manzarek of The Doors to Jane Mansfield were married here. So it has a place in the popular imagination. Aaron Green, one of the primary apprentices, actually the only official associate of Frank Lloyd Wright, this in Palos Verdes, Harwell Hamilton Harris, also influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. Out in Claremont, we have Foster Rhodes Jackson, Lamont Langworthy working in Long Beach, Laguna Beach. Again, all under the influence of the ideas of the American school, whether formally or informally. It shows you how these ideas, and of course Bart Prince also in my Orange County where I live. And in Los Angeles, in particular, John Lautner, subject of one of my books. Because this architecture did not just focus on residential. It was architecture for an entire city, including coffee shops. And John Lautner designed in 1949 the first Googie's restaurant, a restaurant which gave its name to an entire style of new, modern, roadside architecture for the average person as they go about their daily lives. Those ideas also had been started by Lloyd Wright with the Yucca Vine Market in 1926, a building which would capture your eye as you drove by in your car. Modern technology translated into architecture as well. Armand Davis were just one of the firms also influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, because here you have a motif. You have a foundation of concrete or stone, of the earth, growing out of the earth, settled in a landscaped garden, and resting on top of that is a high-tech roof, a cantilevered roof of some sort. So you have nature and technology united in these buildings. They were dismissed as just movie set architecture, two dimensions. No, they were real architecture, really designed by architects who knew what they were doing. So much so that, for example, on the left we have case study house number 22, one of the most famous photographs in architectural history, house by Pierre Koenig, photographed by Julius Schulman, which captures a great deal about modern architecture in this period. Glass, steel, and this view, open architecture, open to the landscape. Well, that's exactly what these coffee shops were also about. But they weren't looking out into the backyard and the view. They were looking out to the street and the cars and the life of the city of that time. They were public buildings, not private buildings. So the same ideas are going on in these buildings, but with different forms, of course. Just briefly now also about concrete. There's so many aspects to the American school which have been integrated into the conventional architecture of our times. One is the use of concrete. And the American school had a tremendous influence on this. Of course, we have Albert and Julius Kahn designing the automotive factories in Detroit and coming up, usually in concrete, with ways to make automotive assembly lines work more efficiently. Well, and then we have Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, Unity Temple, seen here in construction and as it finally was finished as well, using a modern technological material and coming up with new forms for it. Well, Irving Gill out in San Diego worked with tilt-up concrete as well for the Women's Club in La Jolla, a tremendously innovative building. He also built a house on Kings Road just up the street from where Rudolf Schindler was building his house in 1923, also using tilt-up concrete in new ways. Of course, Schindler, today honored, he was an employee of Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, when he first came to the United States. Or the Oasis Hotel, which we've talked about, or Schindler's Lovell Beach House in Newport Beach, using concrete bents, 5 of them stacked up, and the space intertwined between the shapes of these things. New ways to use concrete. And that leads all the way to Frank Lloyd Wright's concrete block houses, the textile blocks houses, and John Lautner houses, and Ken Kellogg houses. The Doolittle House, if you don't know it, Google it. It's in Yucca Valley. It's an extraordinary design and idea and concept of space and structure. To wrap up, there's so much to say about this. What did people in the past say about it? Why was this sort of innovation ignored, not really given its true place in the history of modern architecture? A lot of reasons for that. The dispersal of the students of Wright and Goff all over the country, there wasn't so much of a focus on their work collectively. But we also have the bias of the East Coast academic critics and academies. Esther McCoy, one of the great critics, observers, historians. I recommend that you read anything by Esther McCoy. But from her experience in Los Angeles, she tried to go back and to sell these buildings to the institutions, the media back east. And she found that most of the messages sent west to east get jumbled at the Rockies. They didn't get it. It was so odd. For example, Irving Gill, doing extraordinary modern architecture, he was compared to Adolf Loos. Yes, the buildings look similar, but they're out of very different ideas from very different sources as well. But who cared about an architect in San Diego working in the American school style? Nobody. So he was pigeonholed wrongfully. Or Henry Russell Hitchcock, who, of course, with Philip Johnson, defined modern architecture, the international style, in 1932 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He consciously, he and Johnson both, consciously excluded Rudolf Schindler from that exhibit, saying, "The case of Schindler I do not profess to understand." It was so far, so unconventional, so far ahead, really, of what they were expecting, that it never really took hold. This is part of the story, of course, which we today have a chance to correct. We have the chance to go back, understand who these architects were, and to tell their stories, and to put them into the story of modern architecture as ways that they deserve. Oh, I want to throw this in. Similar things are going on down in Brazil. On the upper left-hand side is Oscar Niemeyer's first house for himself in the 1930s, very much influenced by Le Corbusier, with whom he worked. About a dozen years later, his house was an entirely different form and shape, and of course, reflecting the nature of Brazil as well. So this is an international phenomenon in many ways. So to wrap up, important thing to remember in this story is that many of these European architects trained in Austria or working with Le Corbusier, people like Albert Frey, Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, they're often presented as having brought the seeds of modernism from Europe and planting them in the United States. Well, no. Each of those architects came to the United States not to bring something to it, but to participate in the modern architecture that was already going on in Henry Ford's factories in Detroit, on the roadsides, in the gas stations, in the mass-produced houses, in the steel construction, concrete construction of America that was already underway. They wanted to work in that, and they wanted to work with Frank Lloyd Wright as well. So all of these things came together. They did. They both contributed tremendously to the story in general. But I think this is important to realize that these seeds were here in America. They grew and developed. They spread overseas. They didn't influence the Bauhaus. But the heritage that we have, which the Outré West exhibit shows, is a much richer one and really more rooted in what was going on time-wise, chronologically, et cetera. So that's why this exhibit is so important, and there's so much more work to be done, which I really eagerly look forward to in the next several years. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. And may we have one more round of applause for Alan? So special. Thank you. All right, I'm going to share just a quick update about how the symposium will continue on. So we'll have a brief break now, and we'll rejoin here at 5:05. And then when we come back, we'll hear just briefly from each of the curators of Outré West, and then we'll have a moderated panel led by Alan. So please join us back at just 5 after. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Yep, I think so. Yep. Yep. All right, when you're ready, please take a seat. Get started with our next section here. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Alan, for that incredible introduction to American modern architecture and your advocacy for telling this story. I'm going to introduce the American School of Architecture that originated from OU, and in order to understand that, you really have to know who Bruce Goff was, right? In the post-war context, he was an outlier. At a moment when architects and schools were embracing the international modernism of the Bauhaus, Goff was a renegade. Ada Louise Huxtable, the New York Times architecture critic, captured the clash of ideologies when she called on her readers in New York to give Goff a chance. At the time, the Architectural League in New York City was hosting an exhibition of Goff's work. And you can see images here from the exhibition and from her column that she wrote on this, entitled Peacock Feathers and Pink Plastic. Huxtable implored her readers to visit the show, writing, quote, "Go to the League, gentlemen and ladies, even if those gold and silver presentation boards and houses like Starfish, Viking Ship, and teepees give you fits. If you can shed that eugenically frightening New England Calvinist Harvard Bauhaus intellectual frigidity, if you can suppress a reaction to some obviously homegrown corn, there is an artist here. There is a consistent statement of art and purpose, a sensitivity to the land, a last stand half triumph of the romantic individualist in a world that is forcing the architect to conform increasingly to standardized formulas and business practices." Huxtable continued, describing Goff as a designer of outré fantasies, which elicit a polite frisson along the East Coast axis. This architecture, so out of the mainstream, proclaims a faith in the individual in every philosophical sense, end quote. Outré, a French word meaning violating convention or propriety, unusual and startling, is an apt description for Goff's work. And it is part of that phrase that inspired the title of our show. Goff began developing his individual style as a 12-year-old in Tulsa when he started practicing in a firm, or apprenticing maybe rather. But it was his experience in World War II in the Navy Seabees that really catalyzed a shift towards a more mature style. Goff enlisted in the Seabees during the war. It was the construction battalion, and he was charged with designing military structures out of available materials that could be built quickly. At the Camp Parks Navy base in California, Goff was challenged to design a new chapel using affordable and available materials, primarily brick, plywood, Quonset hut structures, and redwood. Materials were scarce because it was wartime, and so Goff opted to use a Quonset hut structural system. Quonset huts were typically used to quickly enclose space for barracks and warehouses, not for chapels. But here the structure creates a wide and open barrel-vaulted building for this non-denominational worship space. Goff worked with a landscape designer, Ernest Thalman, to ensure that the unusual structure was closely tied to the site through indoor and outdoor gardens and a pool. He viewed the tight budget and labor constraints as a challenge and a springboard for creativity. The project was designed and built quickly. It opened about a year after Goff had arrived on the base. The Camp Parks Chapel was praised by architects and religious leaders alike, and it was published nationally. Architectural Forum ran a 6-page article in December 1945 lauding the design for its, quote, imaginative but highly unorthodox solutions, as well as its material resourcefulness. Later, writing in architectural design, the critic Lionel Marsh captured the power of Goff's invention at Camp Parks. He wrote, quote, the Quonset hut system, consisting of curved corrugated metal shell, was ubiquitous throughout the Western Hemisphere during the Second World War. The semi-cylindrical form spotted the landscape like some poxy infection. Goff takes this system, fit in the popular mind only for the scrap heap, and transforms it into a place of worship. This is a symbolic act, a religious statement profounder than all the art in Coventry, end quote. The publicity surrounding the chapel at Camp Parks helped bring Goff to the attention of faculty at the University of Oklahoma, where they were searching for new leadership. And despite not having a college degree, Goff was hired and elected chairman of the architecture school. After he arrived at OU, Goff recruited an impressive group of faculty, including Mendel Glickman, who was most well known as Frank Lloyd Wright's structural engineer, and Elizabeth Mock, Fay Jones, and others. These renegades, as we've come to call them, promoted a radical approach to teaching design centered on contextualism, resourcefulness, and experimentation. And this was a major departure from what other schools were doing at the time. At the time, most architecture schools in the US followed a curriculum either inspired by the French Beaux-Arts School, and you see an example of that here. In the French Beaux-Arts School, you would learn by drawing and studying neoclassical architecture. Or, by the time Goff is at OU, most schools are adopting the German Bauhaus curricular model. And here you see Mies van der Rohe, a Bauhaus leader at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he led the school after World War II. And note one of his student projects here on the right, which looks very much like an imitation or adaptation of Mies's own work. At the time, the OU School of Architecture was housed in an old Navy barracks on the North Base, and you can see the displays of student work here and what Goff did to transform that space. Rick Hunter, an OU alum, later described what it was like to arrive at this strange school in Oklahoma in the late 1940s. He said, quote, I arrived at the university and I walked into this war barracks building on the North Campus and I was just blown away. I was blown away by the interior and what he had done with strings and painting things black and all this incredible work up on the wall by students. I think within probably about 5 seconds, I had decided, this is where I have to come, end quote. I'm gonna turn it over now to my colleague and partner, Angela Pearson, to continue our story.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Once students enrolled at OU, they were taught to avoid imitation of any kind. The faculty at OU believed the job of an educator was to draw out the individual creativity of each student. They didn't teach us style. Instead of imitation, faculty encouraged students to respond sincerely to the site, client, landscape, and to trust their own creative instincts. This was really radical at the time. To suggest that a student might have the creative energy within to find solutions was in direct opposition to all of the existing schools of thought. To understand how different the OU student approach was, and also their work, we can look at a 1957 publication. This publication includes student work from 52 American architecture schools. Each school was given a 2-page spread in the book to share student work. Here's the student work from Harvard. We can best describe it as Boxes of all kinds, vertical boxes forming skyscrapers, horizontal boxes with rectilinear courtyards carved out. Here's Virginia Tech, more boxes at Virginia Tech, flat roofs and ribbon windows, a whole series of shoeboxes carpeting a hillside in the lower left. Here's more work from IIT, where Mies van der Rohe led the school, Miesian boxes broken apart into planes and lines. And then there's OU, otherworldly, dramatic, and organic visions. A student drawing exercise in the upper left appears almost as though it's melting into the landscape, and as you can see, there are no boxes to be found. Let's take a closer look at just a few student projects to understand how radical the American school approach was at the time. Here we see some of the student work of John Marsh Davis. It wasn't just the work in the publication that was wildly creative and original. As you'll see in the exhibition, there are many, many examples of these really original student projects. In this case, it's a design for an Institute for Mathematical Research that John Marsh Davis completed as a student, unlike anything we've seen before. Here's another John Marsh Davis project. It's a comfort station for golf course restrooms. Here's a project by Faust on the topic of architectural character. Here's a John Herdig project, a student health clinic design. Here's a post office design for Norman, Oklahoma. Here's some student projects by Mickey Muennig, whose built work you saw earlier in Alan's presentation. Here's an incredible drawing by Ernie Burden, Study in Proportion, Transparency, Translucency, and Opacity. This drawing is on the cover of the book Renegades. We love it so much. Here's a couple drawings by Donald McDonald, which you'll see the originals of in the exhibition. Here's an atomic power station drawing. It's just incredible. Before this drawing was moved into the archives, it actually used to hang over the copy machines at OU. It's really beautiful. And that brings us to Outré West, the American School of Architecture from Oklahoma to California, which considers the way in which this student work actually came to life in practice as a handful of these architects moved out to California, many of them, but 5 are featured in the exhibition. And it considers how these 2 Western states, Oklahoma and California, have attracted ambitious and creative visionaries, giving rise to new ideologies that shape the built environment. These folks were educated at OU in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and later developed groundbreaking design practices. The exhibition, we feel, reveals connective threads between these 2 sites, 2 states of the American West, through these architectural ideologies, practices, and the characters like Bruce Goff, Herb Green, and others that shaped them. Educated in the American school approach developed by Bruce Goff and free or freer of European dogma, these architects, often called renegades, as Stephanie mentioned, are iconoclasts and apostates, were taught to prize originality and individual creativity. In California, they found clients and society open to their creative visions. They helped shape the communities and the built environments of the state that's now home to Hollywood and Silicon Valley, places that gave rise to so much of the culture and technology which defines our modern era. The Outré West exhibition showcases the work of 5 architects, shown here, who made their way to California to build an inspiring legacy of practice. We'll take a few minutes now to briefly introduce you to each architect. I'm going to first hand it over to Hans Baldauf, who will begin by introducing us to the work of John Marsh Davis.
Thank you, Angela. Oops. It is my pleasure to introduce the work of John Marsh Davis. John was born in Altus, Oklahoma, which is in the southwestern portion of the state, not far from the Texas border. He was from a prosperous cotton growing and milling family, but because of asthma, never wanted to go into that business. He was profoundly influenced by early family trips to Europe, which led to his interest in architecture. He was fortunate to come to the University of Oklahoma to study under Bruce Goff, graduating in 1955. which was Goff's final year as dean. It was during this time that Goff was designing and building one of his masterpieces, the Bavinger House, for 2 fellow faculty members. Sadly, the house has been demolished, but the exhibition includes a wonderful model and photographs. John's interest in this house seems readily apparent when you look at his student project on the right, which Angela also previously showed, for a project for an Institute for Mathematical Research. Like the Bavinger House, the Institute is hung from a great mast, but here there are volumes that step up, one from the next, creating a series of overlooks. The spaces are actually hung. This is an image of the Bavinger House, and you get the sense of the way that Goff is hanging this roof. And importantly, the spatial organization of the interior, where there are not sleeping rooms, there are pods that are hung from within the building. And this sense of volumes within space is what I want to talk about in a moment. After graduation, John worked briefly in Oklahoma prior to joining the Navy, where he spent a year in Japan, which was also formative for him. After this, he moved to Sausalito, north of San Francisco, where he began his practice architecture in the early 1960s. John had a dynamic career over the next 50 years, designing both residences, wineries, and gardens. I document the early part of his career in Design Legacy of John Marsh Davis, early years, Wood Expressionism, which was published 2 years ago. Like all the renegades in this exhibition, John marched to his own drummer, which included never getting licensed as an architect. In my essay for the Outré West catalog, which has just been released, you can buy it downstairs, that's a shameless plug, I explore how John's works interact with their sites and seek to manifest specific forces within the site. Here I would like to draw your attention to the way in which he manipulates structure for spatial effect. This is the Nash residence, and you can see how there is a great volume of space created with this upper level, in my mind, a reinterpretation of the spatial effect of the Bavinger House. Here it is again. The Thatcher residence on the Sonoma-Napa border is a spectacular location at the crest of a hill, and here John rotates the structure of the roof that spans between 2 chimneys to create the spatial drama inside the house. It's a dramatic two-directional truss system, and it creates this vast open floor plan in which you move around. And then the Weissman-Hamilton House in Carmel has a similar strategy of a great roof form held up by these massive concrete piers, most of which are chimneys, but that allow this house to have glass curtain walls, essentially, and that allow the merging of exterior and interior space, and then you have this similar notion of these different pathways through the building at different levels and levels overlooking levels. And so while different than the Bavinger House, I think there's a spatial learning that John had here under Goff. And with this, I'd like to introduce Rachel Engler, who will speak on Velta Autumn.
Hi. No. Okay, here's Velta Autumn. Perhaps just beginning her time at OU. Maybe it's around 1950, so it would be just a few years after her arrival in the United States. She'd come to this country without her parents, following an elder brother who was studying engineering in Norman. She'd been born in Peru. It seems from the scene here, I don't know what you think, but from her curled hair, her her red nails, the way she confidently poses on the stair in denim, red check shirt, gun in hand, we don't know what in her sights, that she had already come to settle in quite a bit. And yet she was, in many ways, still a kind of fish out of water. Or maybe she was a hybrid anyway, a kind of fish chicken, like the one featured in this recipe in her cookbook from the 1970s, a Russian Jew cooks in Peru. It's an object that tells us a lot, this cookbook, filled as it was with her mother's recipes, derived from the specifically rich cross-cultural intersection that had defined Autumn's childhood. She was the daughter of Eastern European Jewish people who had emigrated to Chiclayo, Peru, where we could say old recipes met new ingredients. Spanish was her first language, and her parents spoke Spanish too, but also Russian and Romanian. Here we get a sense of the texture of this experience. Hers was a childhood in which she grew up eating, apparently, not only chopped liver, but also Brazilian-style avocados. And add to that what we can read from this specific graphic mode of this cookbook, an adult life immersed in the organic style, in countercultural impulses, in the visual tropes of Northern California, where after graduating she made her career as an architect, specifically from her home in Sausalito and Marin. At OU, and here I'm showing you a painting she made during her time as a student, she'd encountered a teacher in Bruce Goff who oriented her toward exactly embracing the specificity of context, of real circumstances, of life in its complexity and variety, of natural environments and materials. She declared something of these commitments in a sort of manifesto-like text she wrote as a student, boldly, I think, titled Truth in the Practice of Architecture. Of course, not only her cookbook, which she undertook as part of a multimedia practice that occupied her until her old age, but also her architecture, her civic advocacy, all of these things reflected her principles. Here's her own house, her most iconic work, built into a cliffside site in Sausalito in 1959 and published both in Progressive Architecture and in Look magazine shortly thereafter. The residence seems nearly to grow out of its cliffside site. You can see particularly here, emerging from the surrounding vegetation, acacia, laurel, shrub oak, scrub oak, mostly left intact, to these brackets of concrete retaining walls, and from there to this bay-facing elevation composed in glass and redwood. We get a better sense of how these materials translated in the interior in this picture of Autumn's son, Keller, ascending the stair tower. We can understand how progress up the stairs charts this elemental shift. At the bottom, there were exposed aggregate concrete walls, and then as you go up, there are these redwood and fir alternating panels that mirror in this way kind of the ascent in a forest. And then at the very top, there's this hexagonal skylight, which is air. I like the picture because it gives, I think, a sense of the way the house was like actually lived. And it was from this house in Sausalito that Autumn worked. Here she is working on a mural for a bank in Nevada. The caption emphasizes that she works on a rug of llama skins, which reflects the paper claims her South American background. From the home's main living area, that's her in the window, and its wall of double-height wood-framed windows, she could look out onto a view of San Francisco Bay, including Alcatraz and the city. In her years of practice as an architect, she took on many projects in the area, from this vacation house near Inverness, California, for a young family. You can see the client at top right, to this house on Sanchez Street in San Francisco that kind of clings to its site like a ship to a dock, somehow the exterior of which, like the Inverness house, expresses itself in wood, though here in a way that I think feels more both like weathered and maritime, and also in the interior more careful and refined. But her effect on the landscape of the region also, and perhaps as importantly, occurred on a bigger scale. Alongside her work as an architect, as a prolific painter, and as we saw, a sometime cookbook author, she did all of these things. She also played a prominent and sometimes rather controversial role in Sausalito city government. She was a member of the Planning Commission, and she was a city council person, often the lone voice of resistance to commercial development schemes. A local reporter described her in dramatic terms as an iconoclast, an absolutely unique figure in small town politics. She also called her a loner and a moral gadfly, which I don't think is quite as nice. But Violetta was instrumental in the preservation of open space in Marin. If anyone's been there, like some of her, resistance is what forms the beauty of the landscape, I would say, or allows the beauty of the landscape to still exist as it does. And she also was interested in safeguarding the historic fabric of the town, which was based on like fishing and shipbuilding infrastructure. In all of these efforts, she seemed to return to the lessons that her own upbringing, dense as it was with contradiction and context, and her time at OU as a student of site and of landscape had taught her. My friend Chris will now come and tell us about Arthur Dyson. Thank you.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to talk about Arthur Dyson, who was born in 1940 in Inglewood, California, the only of the selected architects to be from California originally. And Dyson's interest in architecture bloomed early. At age 18, he was accepted as a Taliesin Fellow to train with Frank Lloyd Wright. This is him at his childhood home, drafting away on some project of his own imagining. And he trained at Taliesin for 1 year before Wright's death in 1959. During that year, Dyson recounts that Wright, during a crit of redlining drawings, had called his work Goffian. So he decided to move to Oklahoma to work for Bruce Goff in Bartlesville, because that was enough. While studying architecture with Wright and Goff, Dyson also attended the University of Wisconsin and the University of Oklahoma, not studying architecture, but instead studying psychology and philosophy. This interest in psychology led Dyson to eventually develop what he calls his client preference questionnaire, a 31-page survey he gives to all his prospective residential clients. The questions are meant as an icebreaker to form a connection between client and architect, and for Dyson to kind of formulate a psychological profile that he can extract design preferences for him to work from. In 1969, Dyson opened his firm, Arthur Dyson & Associates, in Fresno, California, where he still practices today, having designed over 700 projects. Interestingly, although some design tendencies emerge, his portfolio of work is so varied since he rejects any aesthetic regime or style. Instead, Dyson is very quick to credit his clients as the progenitors of each design, citing an ethereal internal blueprint that he believes each person holds in their soul. Above all, this attention to his clients' interests and desires forms meaningful and lasting relationships. This is the Lencioni residence in Sanger, California, built in 1986 for a young couple, Deborah and Dennis Lencioni, on a lot that was gifted to them, and we are fortunate enough to have Deborah in the audience with us tonight. So grab her after if you want to ask questions about being a client. The house's requirements were complex, both needing to keep the house and budget small and address the site condition of being in a floodplain. The resulting design, formed predominantly from these two curving vaulted structures, raises the building above the flood line while an earthen berm nestles against the foundation like a grass blanket pulled snug, hiding its true elevation. The floor plan reveals, surprisingly, a rather conventional home in terms of layout and connection that is made remarkable on the interior through the spatial qualities of the vaulted forms, as you can see in the photo on the right. Jumping in scale is another testament to Dyson's relationship with his clients in the Fresno Betsun Buddhist Temple, a project that started in 1999 and was finally realized in 2022, an over 20-year relationship resulting in one stellar building. And these projects only scratch the surface of Dyson's rich portfolio, which span from residences to religious buildings to schools, libraries, offices, and so much more. But I believe that's all the time I have to talk about it today. So please check out the exhibition downstairs if you haven't already. And I would now like to introduce Amber Sarmiento to talk about architect Donald McDonald.
Thank you, Chris. All right. Donald McDonald was born in Alberta, Canada in 1935. He graduated from OU in '62, got a master's from Columbia in 63, and by 1965 had moved to San Francisco and started his own firm. By the late 70s, McDonald began to apply his ideas on an urban scale. He conceived of and designed a mixed-use project encompassing an entire city block in Mountain View, California. He named it Two Worlds because it unites home with work. It has 62 housing units combined with 20,000 square feet of commercial space. Each building houses 2 to 4 dwelling units, typically located over this commercial space or parking. In this site plan on the right, you can see buildings that are clustered around 8 groupings around shared courtyards. These courtyards have existing trees that were elegantly protected and incorporated into the site design and protected during construction. By choosing a cream-colored cement plaster as an exterior finish, he encouraged light to reflect throughout the site. With green tile roofs and rich green tile accents around windows and doors, he subtly reinforced the contextual relationship to the trees on the site. The ground level residential units have an additional small courtyard surrounded by a tall plaster wall, seen here a bit right of center, that is a clear delineation between public and private space. In this photograph, we see that even on the second level, residences have walled-in patios for privacy in addition to an open wood deck. At the time of its construction in the early 80s, this concept of a mixed-use development inserted into an established setting was so innovative that the global nonprofit, the Urban Land Institute, used this project as a case study in their book, Making Infill Projects Work. McDonald calls it a suburban village. That he refers to it as a village reflects his understanding of the human desire for social connection. And while dense and walkable like a village, it also recognizes our psychological need for privacy, but also the American desire for ownership of space. Each dwelling entrance faces inward to a courtyard, fostering a sense of community with the neighbors, within a semi-private space that progressively becomes more private as you approach each unit's individual entrance. This concept was so successful that McDonald evolved a village typology from it. And he went on to design several more suburban villages, as well as this urban village in Oakland that won the 1991 World Habitat Award. In addition to affordable housing, this project includes lower level parking for the city of Oakland, parking for its residences, a senior center in the high-rise portion, as well as a daycare center. McDonald has become known for his work within the urban context, and he has designed urban infill projects, high-rises, mixed-use projects, and in the last quarter of a century, bridge design. But throughout the 1980s, McDonald designed dozens of small homes throughout San Francisco, designed specifically for people who might be priced out of the market and might remain renters indefinitely. In 1991, he unveiled a new house prototype called the Starter Home. And at 300 square feet, it literally is a tiny home. I view this starter home as the culmination of these tiny house projects on a path to home ownership. And with American school resourcefulness, he uses practical, affordable, and readily available materials. But the real ingenuity behind the design in this project is that it is incremental architecture. It was designed with a flexible plan that could be expanded either horizontally or vertically over time as the owner could afford to do so. The suburban starter home to the left shows the possibilities for a larger lot size that could accommodate lateral growth. And in large cities where land is more expensive and limited, there's potential for vertical growth in the urban starter home. He also incorporates his affinity for all things structural by designing it to withstand seismic events, something that is front and center in the minds of Bay Area architects. McDonald credits OU professor Mendel Glickman with his strong foundation in structural engineering, which is evident throughout his entire 60-year career. From the arc in 1970, where we see external bracing to support a heavy roof load, snow loading, and walls inset several feet from the roof eaves to reduce pressure against the outside walls from downhill snow creep, to the stunning new east span of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, designed following the bridge's partial collapse during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Donald McDonald is now nearing 90, still living in San Francisco and doing well. He continues his work in bridge design to this day. Thank you. And now here to tell us a bit about Mickey Muennig, Marco Piscitelli.
Thank you, Amber. Nope. Mickey Muennig was born in Missouri in 1935 and studied architecture at OU in the late 50s. In 1971, he visits the sublime landscape of Big Sur, California. Having a transcendental experience at Esalen Institute, the infamous New Age and Countercultural Retreat Center, he, now a self-described hippie, decides to move there and start his practice, and is now remembered as the man who built Big Sur. His oeuvre mostly houses for the community's landed class, quote, has important lessons to give us about how to build with the land rather than on it, as Aaron Betsky once opined. That this body of work is so tied with Big Sur's landscape serves an essential mediatic function in shaping the image of Big Sur and its culture in the popular imaginary. Muennig's first project in Big Sur was a decades-long performance piece on how to live intentionally. Quote, I couldn't have many possessions there, but I experienced every wind gust, hundreds of different sunsets, fluorescent moonlight, and quietness. Built in 1972, a house and drawing studio for his family on Partington Ridge, this dwelling is remarkable in its simplicity, both in form and in tectonics, combining principles of low-impact construction with a clear, legible geometry. Still, while a test of passive solar technology, it notably is an innovative attempt to develop a relationship between himself and the land. In his glass teepee, as he called it, the architect fosters an intentional lifestyle reminiscent of ideas and practices prototyped in California in the prior decade. Muennig's studio was at once a spatial cum spiritual manifestation of intentional living aligned with the so-called chthonic energies of the landscape. It was also an experiment in sustainability, showing a deep fascination with innovative environmental controls, which by the 1970s had become a central question in architectural discourse. After over a decade of construction and planning, Muennig eventually completes his own Partington Ridge residence in 1994. This house is subterranean. Muennig's years of intervention into Big Sur's ecological and juridical ecosystem drives him to excavate. A structure carved into the hillside was invisible from Highway 1, resistant to earthquake and fire, and more efficient to condition. Technologically, this structure shares much with others in the architect's collection of buildings, deploying features like a green roof, solar heating, and passive ventilation to integrate the house into its climate. I argue that here we also see a decentering of the human body as the sole inheritor of architecture in favor of the wider, entangled, multi-species ecosystem living alongside and within us. As Muennig claims, quote, we should be glad when rust settles on a razor blade, when a wall grows moldy, or when moss grows over the geometric angles of a corner, because, together with microbes and mushrooms, life thus moves into a house. A circular door inscribed into a richly planted hillside allows entry into the house's subterranean depths. Passing through this concrete moon gate, which you will see in the exhibition, one is surprised to encounter a bright skylit courtyard. The main living spaces are a trilobate form clustered around this rectilinear glassy space. Designed to retract open, the skylight bathes the courtyard richly planted with olives, bananas, and palms in a silver light. This geometric composition and axis from entry to fireplace aligns precisely with the sunset at the winter solstice, poetically marking the passage of time with an annual marriage of sunbeam and hearth. The house is otherwise entirely inward in its focus. Subverting the power of the gaze to survey out and thus own a landscape, this project is suggestive, I would argue, of Muennig's own philosophy and innovates a resolution to an age-old opposition between nature and culture. Muennig's house is indistinct in its enclosure. The boundary between the interior, the human, the ordered, the sacred, and the exterior, non-human, chaotic, and profane, is blurred, negating the very notion that bodies, buildings, and biomes are fixed, discrete, and independent entities. You almost don't see the architecture, Muennig once fondly mused. That his subterranean court is open to below, with no barrier between the interior world and the living soil beneath, complete with its mycelia, microbes, and invertebrates, suggests a radical potential for an organic architecture, which does not impose, but seeks to celebrate the complexly entangled ecologies of our bodies and their surround. Thank you. I'd like to invite Alan to come up, and my colleagues as well, for our discussion.
Thank you all for amazing to gel down each of these incredible architects into such a brief but telling story. Thank you. That's hard to do, I know. So there's so many questions involved with this, but what I want to ask is, you're now familiar with these architects. What was it about their personality, their character, that related directly to their architecture, their design, but also their commitment to this sort of work over, decades? Any ideas on that from any of you, or?
Yeah, I think quite clearly with Dyson, it's really that relational aspect and how he always comes back to his clients. And I think the commitment to the architecture and to the work is really just an innate desire within him to be relational with people and connect with people on a very intimate level and get to know them and get to share his love and passion for design with the world.
I think that for John, it was the people, his clients. And I remember talking with one of his earliest clients, Nancy Barber, who went to interview John, and she came back to talk to her husband, and she said, I didn't really interview John, John interviewed me. And I think that it's that desire to connect and bring design to the service of the client that was the animating force for John. And that otherwise, he was also content to work on his own house, which was like a Taliesin for him, that he would rip it apart and rebuild it. And so design was this life. It was a way of living for him, and clients and projects only worked to the degree that they worked in his vision of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say Muennig as well pursued quite an intentional and unusual practice in that he moves to this tiny community of just 800 landowners and becomes this fixture in the community, so much that not only was he coined the man who built Big Sur, but he had nicknames in the community like Magic Mickey, and people called him the Hobbit that lived in the hill. He was this very strange character, actually, that was able to really reach the hearts and minds of all of these, Calvin Klein-clad hippies in Big Sur, as described in a newspaper clipping you'll see inside.
Can you tell us a little bit about wand that's in the exhibit in relation to that?
In that same line of thinking, you'll find a very strange artifact that we are so happy to have in our archives and exhibit here. There's a magic wand made of brass and steel and silver and shells and a dice and glass. It was commissioned by the owners of Post Ranch Inn, a hotel Mickey Muennig completes in 1994, and I think is really part of this. It represents, we can say, this image that Muennig has built for himself as this wizard-like figure capable of producing magic on the landscape.
And that isn't just a conceit of some sort. If you've been to Big Sur, the Post Ranch Inn and his other houses, it can be kind of a mystical landscape. The fog comes in off the ocean, creeps up these steep cliffs, and so you're wandering through these forests, and you come upon a Mickey Muennig house as well. So it does capture the place.
Exactly.
Any other comments on personalities?
Okay, I'm being urged to talk about Violetta's personality, which is a distinct one, I think, according to everyone I've spoken to. And maybe though, like, it's a different quality that she brings, like a sort of scrappy resourcefulness and like a kind of will to be busy and to occupy herself with all kinds of things and a diversity of engagements. And I don't know, I mean, the kind of thing that made her feel like she would accomplish more the more she did. Maybe that contributes to the diversity of her output.
Go ahead.
Okay. Donald, I'll speak about him for just a minute. He is a just powerhouse of a character. He's a well-known local character in San Francisco at this point. And I would say the thing that really strikes me, I've actually met him and spent some time with him out there last winter. He is really just passionate about improving society in general and serving his community, and through design. Basically, he's interested in solving social problems through design, which, I didn't talk about this, but if you go down and look at the exhibit, he even has a little individual shelter down there that he designed in the mid-'80s for the unhoused population that he basically encountered on his doorstep, literally. So I would say he takes that kind of resourcefulness as well and just pushes it back out there to the community.
So one of the criticisms that I have encountered of John Lautner's work, for example, is along these lines. It's too idiosyncratic. It is so individual. How can it doesn't have any general application? So I wanted to ask either Angela or Stephanie, what is it about the teaching of Goff and at OU that was able to work with these unique individuals? They don't sound like the standard heroic architectural ego. And yet, how did the pedagogical system work at OU to deal with these sorts of, and even to support and activate these sorts of personalities?
I love this question so much, and I think we both should say a little bit about it. One thing that is really special about Bruce Goff and Herb Green and the collection of faculty that were attracted here is that they were practicing architects who drew very well, who built close relationships with contractors, who worked with the students also to build their homes. And so the students got to see from start to finish what it took to conceive of something otherworldly that came from within and came from the site, to actually delineate it technically and to work with the best engineer in the country or among the best, and then to get it built. And I think that being able to see it from start to finish, helping to build the Bavinger House and the Prairie House, is really transformational for the students. And it empowered them to go out into the world and to be able to do very distinct works of their own, but very special works as well.
Yeah, that was such a great answer. I'll try to add something to it. In terms of like the resistance to designing architecture that had a general applicability or that you could use more than once, Goff was obsessed with the idea that every project you should start new, right? And so every project had to be an original. And he had an insatiable appetite for creative production of all sorts. So he painted and made collages. He was a musical composer. He collected records. And you get the sense that the reason he wanted students to produce new work and original work that was not an imitation of his was because he was really genuinely interested in like new creative production. Like he didn't want to see something that had already been done and done and done and done again. He wanted to know like, what can you do that I haven't seen? What is the latest record that I haven't heard? I want to hear and see something new and fresh. And so that was infused in the pedagogy, and I think it's what attracted some of these original folks to OU, but then also what was supported while they were here was this idea that the only thing you couldn't do was an imitation of something that already existed. And so the idea that the architecture is so original that, you know, you can't really copy it or replicate it, I think he would be excited about that idea, even though I think that is often a critique, as you noted. Yeah.
If any of you have any comments to any of these, just jump right in. Hans?
I think what's really interesting is when Amber's speaking about Donald's community fixation. And I think that comes from this, in a way, weirdly, I mean, there's a sort of a humility amongst all of these people in their crazed pursuit of design. And you know, there's architecture cuts both ways. You can have super ego crazed for design, but you can also have sort of humility and thinking about a house that you can walk on the soil in. There's a kind of humility in that. And I think that caring about your clients like the way John did, there's a kind of humility. And I think Donald was amazing in that he got so many architects published and created exhibitions, that he was interested in community that way, in a way maybe more profound than John was, but he and John had worked together, and so he included him in the community. And so I think there is this ethos that I think must have come out of the teaching here of being part of a community, and that was super important to carry forward into California.
I just have a small piece to piggyback off of that. I was thinking yesterday and talking to Marco about how the American school is so relational, and we see this across these folks, as you were saying, Hans. Many of them worked together when they moved out to California. They stayed in touch. They collected photographs and reproductions of one another's drawings and projects. Nelson, who was mentored by Bruce Goff for a time, he came here all the way from Atlanta for this event. And he brought his friend Laura, who lives in a Bruce Goff house. So there's this really rich community of folks that continues to this day, with the understanding that this work that was being done is important, and the lessons that were being taught are super important to this day, and we should continue, with this contextual, resourceful, and experimental approach to teaching.
Is this unique? I mean, I'm thinking about, Harvard under Walter Gropius and coming up with kind of a scientific equation for how to develop architecture for very noble purposes, including, public housing, et cetera, et cetera. But it just seems so different, this sort of approach. But it's kind of a rhetorical question. Does it work? I mean, obviously it did if it produced all of this architecture.
Stephanie's writing a book right now about creativity, so I'm going to pass her the mic.
I think in terms of if your goal is producing creative architects, it absolutely works. But I think it also works in a different lens, which we can only now really understand. It's been, 80 years since Gropius and Mies these Bauhaus architects arrived in American architecture schools, and I think they did a lot of wonderful things, but they also taught their students, as those images showed, that Angela showed, to design the same thing everywhere. And that makes sense in a way, because if you think of the German Bauhaus as coming out of the interwar period in Europe, where there was a tremendous need for building efficiently and quickly, we can respect what they were doing. They were figuring out how to do that. But today we can look at that and go, wow, it is not a great idea to build the same building in Winnipeg and Mexico City. And glass boxes don't belong in either of those places, because there is a tremendous burden that we've placed on the environment when we say we're going to build the same thing for anyone, anywhere. And I think we're only now starting to recognize the cost of that approach. And now we can look at what like Mickey Muennig was doing in terms of using passive and active strategies for environmental controls together to make a lighter impact on the built environment and to build respectfully of the sites and the people. And I think it's really time to take another look at that and see what we can learn about the human relationship to nature and the environment and how to coexist more respectfully than what the Bauhaus ended up bringing into American architecture schools. Yeah.
Chris?
Yeah, building off of that, on one of my visits to Fresno, talking with Dyson, he recounted the dozens and dozens of letters he's gotten over the year of architects across the country saying, hey, I saw this house, can I buy the plans for it so I can build it in Minnesota or wherever they're from? And he said at this point he has a script that he sends back that is very polite and says, I'm sorry, it's for this client on this site for this time, for this amount of money, and it should never and will never exist in another iteration. And that just kind of commitment to these are so personal, the works, and they are personal both to the clients and the environment, that I think is so important about the work and how we think about building today as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing. It reflects the value system, right? That the goal was to train architects to invent new things. And I like to think of it as Goff was training chefs and Mies and Gropius were training line cooks. They were training architects to use their limited set of ingredients. You can only use glass, steel, boxy forms, pilotis, flat roofs, ribbon windows. Like there's a limited set of ingredients that the Mies and Gropius would allow their students to use. And so their students just end up adapting the recipes of the masters, right? Mm-hmm. And Goff is doing the exact opposite. He's saying, I want to know what you can do if I throw at you copper tubing, slag glass, and wood shingles. Put these crazy ingredients together and produce something novel, and you've got a week to do it. And he really genuinely wanted to see what they were doing. And of course, when we think about like culinary school, you would never go to culinary school and be told you're only going to adapt the recipes of your professor, who, by the way, is a German, who only cooks with these 3 things. That's crazy. We know that's not like the highest art in terms of the culinary arts. But that's what was happening at all of these other schools, except for OU. Mm-hmm. They were training chefs.
Mm. And I think this degree of iconoclasm that was sort of bubbling up out of Oklahoma in the 1950s really does produce not a series of crazed individualists, but actually people that are deeply humble about their profession, as we mentioned earlier. And there's this funny parable. Mickey Muennig was once asked this very question: what is your theory for architecture? What should architecture be? And he responded with, I don't know, I forgot to develop a doctrine. Which is so poetic, isn't it?
And often I've found that a lot of California architects of all kinds built their theories. They had ideas and they just went out and built them. They didn't spend a lot of time writing them down and perpetuating them in different ways. Well, with this issue, we're getting very up to today. I mean, ecological issues, environmental issues are so serious these days. What what are the lessons here? These aren't just, interesting histories, but what are the lessons for today that these can show us the way about?
This is brief, but one thing that comes to mind is Donald would design specifically cleverly enough to create minimal waste with many of his projects. In other words, knowing the size that plywood comes in 4x8 in increments to where there's going to be less cuts and less waste. That's just a small example, but something that he's utilized regularly.
But I think I would also add, and this is part of the reason why I'm so glad we have the McDonald archive and all the work that you've done on McDonald, because he's the only architect represented in this exhibition that has done all of this work in cities. And I think cities are the future of architecture. We are not going to encounter a fundamental truth about how to pursue more sustainable dwellings on cliffside sites in Big Sur. It really is in re-inhabiting the city and celebrating density, for example, among many other things.
Can I add something like in relation to that? Because I feel like on the other hand, something that interests me is Velta Autumn as like an architect being so invested in not building a lot of the time, in preserving open space and leaving it without anything. And that there's some lesson there too, not about humility necessarily, but about how sometimes maybe you need to throw like a wrench into the machinery, and just stop and say no. And that there's something very brave about being invested in construction and then, also doubting progress.
I will just have to hop in to defend Dyson really quickly. And I think he also is working in cities in Fresno, right in the valley, which is a very different kind of condition than being on the coast. But equally as engaged with the community and people there, especially in schools and libraries and civic buildings of all sizes.
I think that the landscape component is a super important thing, and I think that Donald's project that you showed how he preserved the trees in that site and actually designed the project around the site, and it made me think that John, toward the end of his career, was more interested in designing gardens than he was designing houses. And I met him only one time, and before I even got involved with working on his legacy. And I met him, and he described himself as a landscape architect to me. And I thought of the Bruce Goff Chapel, and that even on a military base at that time, that Goff was interested in that pool of water, that landscape, that kind of connection. And I think that relationship of building to the environment through landscape is one of the most urgent needs we have today, because we're mediating at all times between a built environment and the rest of the environment, whether it's in a city or on any site, and being thoughtful about that and having it sort of hardwired into your system. And like Violetta's house herself is in an essay in how to adapt to a very complex site without destroying it. And I think it's, I think this is like one of the big issues of today.
I'll add on, and we've touched on this just a little bit. I think that the emphasis on resourcefulness and use of local materials is another really important lesson for today. And I would love to see sort of the new age of the American school looking at adaptive reuse. I think that what Goff did with the chapel on the base is a form of adaptive reuse. He was thinking about how do we use these Quonset structures that we have so readily available on this military installation. But I think that this is something that I would love for our students to be thinking about. It doesn't always have to be a brand new piece of architecture. You can apply, your own design sensibility to adapting these existing structures. Like Hans does, yeah.
Maybe it's just me being defensive, but I keep thinking about the criticisms of organic architecture and Wright and Goff and so forth. I've been kind of inundated in it for so many years. But I want to ask you about engineering. oftentimes the criticism, when people will look, especially at John Lautner House, they would think, it's, or making Muennig as well, it's what was called in the 60s wood butchering. Just getting some old materials, throwing them together, and is related to the hippie culture of that time very much. But these people and the school had a very rigorous engineering education as well. And Mickey is a good example, but the others are as well. Is this an important part? And secondly, how do we apply that today to the advances in materials, structures, systems, 3D printing, computer design, etc. Any ideas on that? Lessons from these people?
Well, I think what I tried to point out in the few slides of John's work that I showed is that engineering lies behind all of this, and that it is how you pull off Mickey's projects, how you pull off Arthur's projects. Donald's bridges are like direct essays in engineering, and he's not the structural engineer, but I think what somehow got inculcated here was a way of working with engineers to be profoundly creative. So you need to know, as an architect, enough engineering to push your engineer to do spectacular things. And I think that somehow that's the lesson that was imbibed. And it's super interesting to me that Goff's first hire as a faculty member was not another architect, but an engineer. Frank Lloyd Wright's engineer.
Mendel Glickman, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I will say, Dyson cites Glickman, who at that point his interaction was while working in Goff's office. Glickman was doing all the structures for the projects, and he cites Glickman as really where he learned how to build buildings. Goff and Frank Lloyd Wright showed him how to design buildings. He cites Lloyd Wright in teaching him how to draw buildings, but Glickman is really where he learns how to make buildings real. And I think transitioning it from his practice to kind of up-and-coming things today, a lot of Dyson's projects were built by the people in his office who were in charge of drawing them as well, where it was, oh, you can't figure it out on a page, you need to go out in the site and start building it and figure it out there, and then you'll come back and draw it too, if you need to, just to record how that was happening. But as we think about design build and architects as developers and really trying to unite these ideas of construction and design, or just really being intentional and forming better relationships with the people you're working on to build buildings.
One thing that we learned looking at the history of the development of Big Sur is that not only was there tremendous, perhaps the most strict building code in the country, even overlaid on top of existing coastal commission legislation. Muennig was also, and Muennig and his contemporaries in Big Sur as well, were forced to come up with solutions to certain material accessibility. So, for example, many of the structures are built using recycled redwood timber from railroad trestles, which were taken down during the construction of Highway 1 in the 1920s. But I think this small parable starts to speak to architects not just being sort of master builders on one hand, or kind of hyper charismatic politicians. We can think of all of the sort of villain caricatures of architects in the past, right? Instead, all of these architects were members of a community which included builders, clients, contractors, manufacturers. And in the case of Muennig, for example, so much of his work happened on site with impromptu conversations and quick napkin sketches with contractors to figure out small construction details. It ended up producing a bit of a paucity of the detail in many of his projects, in the archive at least, but it reveals how much of architecture happens on site, so to speak, not just at the drafting table. That being said, I'm really glad that we do have many construction documents from all of these architects to reveal that they weren't wood butchers, right? They weren't DIY hippies throwing stuff together. They were rigorous and really needed to have sort of all the tools at their disposal, all of the tricks of the architectural trade, so to speak. So I encourage you to look at some of these construction documents that we have downstairs to really see how this stuff came together.
Should we start taking some questions from the audience as well? Do you have any? And anybody? Christina. Oh, we have a microphone coming.
Thank you. I was curious as you were talking about the diversity. I remember seeing something yesterday about the architecture being tied to the slow food movement, and that made me think, in light of this conversation today, and the diversity of approaches, it made me think about, you know, we know now about how dangerous it is to have a monoculture. And Stephanie, your description, well, everyone's description really, of sort of that Bauhausian international style pedagogy that gets laid onto the architecture schools, and then what's happening here. I'm wondering if that resonates with any of you, that what's happening here is the antidote to maybe a monoculture or something like that.
I think Hans mentioned slow food, so I'm there.
And given your analogy, Stephanie, to cooks, I think it actually, the evolution of the food world is the realization that there is this tension between feeding the planet as cheaply as possible, quote unquote, and feeding the planet healthfully. And I think that the slow food movement believes that ultimately, not only do we have the best tasting food, but we have the most healthy planet when we look at it through that lens. And I think monocultures, and Michael Pollan's book talks a lot about these problems, are a real problem. And so this celebration of diversity, the celebration of complexity, the working out of things anew each season, so to speak, is a metaphor for how we can lead our lives, how we can design our buildings, and how we can enjoy a richer experience. And I think that for me, it's one of the things that Carlo Petrini, who founded the slow food movement in Italy, talks about is the joy of eating. And I think that joy is one of those words that it's easy to sort of laugh at and attack and all of that, but it's actually what we all want. And I think that that's really what lies behind this work, is a great amount of joy. And I think that's really, really powerful.
Goes back to Vitruvius, firmness, commodity, and
delight.
Delight, exactly.
I also think, this is just a small comment, that there's something fascinating about linking resilience to a desire that Goff, Green, and others had in cultivating individuality in their own students, right? A multiplicity of ideas is what the world needs, not a single model that can fix things everywhere for everyone.
And I want to nod back to Donald McDonald's work, and maybe Amber, you have more to say about this. But he gives us an example of what it can look like to house many folks in a novel way that is very site-specific and really precious, but also of the American school. And I don't know if you want to say any more.
I think you said it really well. I don't know what I would add to that. Yeah, I mean, he does, and he does it he repeats it differently in each way, in each time that he does it. So it's a little bit unique, but he's develops these typologies to which you can apply the same the same way in which you are, tackling similar subjects, but in a different way each time, and very well, basically, does a great job of that. Yeah. Sorry.
Other questions? In back here?
Yeah, Art Dyson talks a lot about, we talked a lot about the mental health aspect of a building and how I call it architherapy, how a building can make a person feel or how you can change depending on where you are.
That is very true. She is the expert. Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. And it ties back to Dyson's kind of insistence on psychology in building. And he thinks a lot about colors and every single thing that gets put in the house. And frequently with a lot of these architects, focusing on interiors as well with different built-ins and how you move through it and where things go. But in every step of the way, doing that with the client to work best for them, which as a small side note, I think is fascinating to hear about, who gets the house next, right? What happens when it goes on the market next and finding the right person to take the house, which has been the case with a lot. And we're actually here with another client as well, who has recently bought a Dyson house and thankfully let me stay in it on one of my trips, which was an illuminating experience that I write about in the catalog as well. So it's excellent to see people kind of taking that on and coming to find little narrative moments embedded in the home of all these small stories that are so personal and yet so delightful to find even if you don't know the story.
I'm just going to add to that in terms of Goff and what he was teaching and this question of like the emotional response that he was trying to help students understand. He used music as a teaching tool, so he would have these listening sessions, and I've been trying to figure that out for this book project that Angela mentioned that I'm working on. And I think what he was doing was helping students understand that music has this tremendous power to elicit emotional responses, right? Like if you hear a certain song on the radio, you're immediately taken back to a moment in time, or you feel sappy, or you feel energized, or you feel like dancing. And musical composers do that by putting together, by using their toolkit effectively. And their toolkit is like loud and quiet, fast and slow, monophonic and polyphonic, and a million other things, right? Like it's so complicated. And so if you listen to music and you understand that it has this power to evoke emotion in time, architecture has that power in time and space, right? Like we get to do even more. But few architects understand what is our toolkit, which is size and shape, proportion, texture, color, all of those things that Chris just mentioned. And how do you put them together in sequence to choreograph an emotional experience in time and space together at one time? And I think that's what Goff was doing with a lot of the assignments in his 273 class. So he was trying to pull out like, okay, you're just gonna work with loud and quiet today. But instead he would say that's modulation or transparency. You're just gonna try to figure out a composition that is transparent, translucent, and opaque all in one, and just work on manipulating that range in your assignment. But I think ultimately what he was doing was trying to get students to practice using different aspects of the architectural toolkit to elicit emotion the same way that musical composers did. And that's what all these architects figured out in their work from the teaching here.
And architecture discourse today is engaging questions on affect, or we can say emotion. In the 1950s, that would have been anathema. For an architect to talk about feeling, an architect at Harvard, for example, or IIT, it would have been absolutely absurd, right? So in many ways, all of these architects, I think we would argue, were quite forward-thinking.
And we'll take one more question here.
So most of the more interesting examples that you've shown today are houses done for individuals who were working with these architects because they wanted something different or special. And you certainly see that in Goff's later works. He had a ready market for people who did not want a house that looked like anyone else's. My particular work that I'm working on right now is the beginning of Goff's career, where you see a lot of examples of him trying to figure out how far he can push it, how much he can get away with. And he's working for a very successful, but naturally conservative architectural firm that is primarily working in, or trying to work in, commercial buildings, big projects. There's a, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, this is during the height of the oil boom. Lots and lots of office buildings, department stores, corporate buildings, you know, with a desire to build them as big as the engineering could support. And he is submitting his designs and getting some of them, but failing a lot of times as his clients choose the submission of a more conservative architect, frequently his partner, Rush, doing something in neoclassical or doing something in something else. So you guys are involved in the now, pushing what you're saying. Let's, you know, use your imagination, express your creativity. Don't just mildly adapt something that is in somebody else's town. And are the people that you deal with who are practicing that finding an appetite in things that are bigger than some rich guy's house and doing things that actually have scale? And when you go into a town, you see it, you know, wow, you know, that's really part of that city's landscape. Anyway, it just...
I think Donald has.
Yeah, well, no, I guess Donald, you don't get much bigger than a bridge across San Francisco Bay, and it doesn't get more famous than when it gets put on an NBA team's jersey that happens to win the NBA championship multiple times. So, and you know, when I cross, because I live in San Francisco, and I get the benefit of crossing that bridge regularly, and it's a revelation, because for those of you who know the Bay Bridge, it's a two-level bridge, or was a two-level bridge, both the east and west span, or the north and south spans, depending how you want to think about it. San Francisco to Yerba Buena Island, 2 levels, the suspension bridge, and the cantilever portion, which fell down in the earthquake and got replaced by Donald. It's now both levels, both directions are on one level. And it is transformative because you see Oakland from the deck, and it changes your very relationship to the entire Bay Area, because you can see the East Bay. And so I think Donald has made this leap that's more than just like a skyscraper or a big building. He's leapt from, you know, doing all these wonderful small houses to the meta urban scale. And so I think there's a roadmap for it. I mean, we should all go compete with him to design bridges. But no, and he has one under construction, by the way, that I went and visited quickly when I was in Miami recently. That's this interchange in the middle of the entire city of Miami. It's going to be the landmark for Miami. I mean, it changes how you see things. I don't know, Amber, you should probably...
Well, no, I actually love that you're talking about your experience driving over it. I know that, you know, it was under construction for 15 years or something like that. So the entire time that it was, you know, they had to leave up the old bridge next to it while they're building the new one. And so for well over a decade, people are driving alongside of it, getting more and more excited about it as it goes up. And yeah, just to follow up on something that you said, he's designed dozens of bridges. The thing that he says is most exciting about them is just how excited the entire city becomes and that it really becomes something that the entire population can get behind and unites them and symbolizes basically their city, you know? So it's very exciting, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I just want to say that, you know, the exhibit, the catalog, which is for sale downstairs. Oh, next slide. Oh, pull it. Back one. Okay.
You can plug it for us now.
So it is available. It's a beautifully produced book, I have to say. And what we have talked about today, what is in the book, what is in the exhibit, is an incredible foundation. Start talking, as we discovered today, about really important, relevant issues today. So I can't wait to see where this is all going to go. There's so much more to be studied, researched, analyzed, and applied to today. So I want to thank all of our panelists and the audience for coming. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we would like to invite you all downstairs to the second floor. There's a bar and some snacks and a little reception, and you can visit the show again. And it will be, the museum is open till 9. Yeah. And there's also all these other wonderful books which you can find with the QR code here.